In the year 1894, a child was born who was destined to become the King of Britain. His name was Edward Albert Christian George Andrew Patrick David. From the first day of his life, the future of Edward was already decided. He was born into a world of royal traditions, duty, and responsibility. Everyone knew that one day he would wear the crown of Britain. As the son of King George V and Queen Mary, Edward grew up knowing that his life belonged to the nation. Every action, every decision, and every step was connected to the future of the monarchy. But Edward was different from many royals before him. He wanted to understand ordinary people. He wanted to travel beyond palace walls. He wanted to see the real lives of those he would one day rule. The public admired his confidence and modern personality. Many believed Edward would become a king who would bring a new beginning to the British monarchy. But behind the royal image there was a man who wanted something more than power. He wanted freedom. He wanted happiness. He wanted someone who could love him as a person and not only as a future king. Nobody knew that the greatest battle of Edward's life would not be fought on a battlefield. It would happen inside his own heart. A battle between duty and desire. Between the crown and love. A decision that would change British history forever. In 1931, Edward met a woman who would change his entire future. Her name was Wallis Simpson. She was an American woman with a strong personality and a different way of thinking. Edward was attracted to her confidence and intelligence. With Wallis, he felt something he had never found inside the royal world. He felt free. When he was with her, he was not only a prince. He was simply a man searching for happiness. Their friendship slowly became a deep love. Edward believed that Wallis was the only person who truly understood him. But their relationship created a storm around the British monarchy. Wallis was already married and she had been married before. For the traditional royal family, this relationship was impossible to accept. A future king was expected to follow the rules of the crown. But Edward believed that love was stronger than tradition. Soon the entire nation would discover that one man's personal choice could change the future of the monarchy forever. The question was no longer only about love. The question was about the crown itself. The year was 1936. King George V passed away. The nation entered a period of mourning. Edward finally became King Edward VIII. The crown he had been preparing for since childhood was now resting on his head. Millions celebrated the beginning of a new reign. People believed Britain had found a young modern king who would lead the country into a brighter future. But behind the palace walls another story was unfolding. Edward had already made up his mind. He wanted Wallis Simpson to become his wife. The news spread through the government and the royal family. Shock quickly turned into fear. The Prime Minister and senior officials warned the king that such a marriage would create a constitutional crisis. The Church of England could not accept the marriage. The government could not support the marriage. Many members of the royal family strongly opposed the marriage. Edward listened to every warning. He understood every consequence. Yet his heart remained unchanged. For the first time in British history, a king was prepared to risk everything for the woman he loved. Every newspaper waited for the next announcement. Every citizen wondered what their king would do. Would he choose the crown that had belonged to generations of British monarchs? Or would he choose the woman who had captured his heart? The answer would become one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the British monarchy. The decision was approaching. And there would be no way back. December 1936 arrived. The entire nation waited for the king's final decision. Inside Buckingham Palace, the pressure continued to grow. Government leaders pleaded with Edward to choose his duty. The church stood firm against the marriage. Members of the royal family hoped he would change his mind. But Edward had already made his choice. He could not imagine a future without Wallis Simpson. On December 10, 1936, Edward signed the document that ended his reign. With one signature, he gave up the throne of Britain. The crown that had been prepared for him since birth was no longer his. The following day the world listened as Edward spoke to the nation. His voice was calm but filled with emotion. He explained that he could not carry the heavy responsibility of being king without the help and support of the woman he loved. Those words echoed across Britain and around the world. Many people were shocked. Some admired his honesty. Others believed he had abandoned his duty. The British Empire had never witnessed anything like this before. A king had willingly stepped away from the throne for love. His reign had lasted only 326 days. It became one of the shortest reigns in British history. After Edward left the throne, his younger brother Albert became King George VI. No one had expected Albert to become king. Yet history had chosen a different path. Edward walked away from the greatest position in the empire. He left behind the palace, the crown, and the throne. But he believed he was walking toward the only life that could truly make him happy. His decision would forever remain one of the most extraordinary moments in the history of the British monarchy. After leaving the throne, Edward was given the title Duke of Windsor. In 1937, Edward and Wallis Simpson were finally married in France. The wedding was small and elegant. But one thing was impossible to ignore. No senior member of the British royal family attended the ceremony. The couple began a new life together far from the palace they had once called home. Edward had chosen love over power. But the life he imagined was not as peaceful as he had hoped. Many people continued to criticize their relationship. The royal family kept its distance. Edward was no longer the man who would shape the future of Britain. Instead, he watched history unfold from outside the walls of the monarchy. During the Second World War, questions were raised about Edward and his political views. His public image became even more complicated. Some believed he had made the greatest romantic sacrifice in history. Others believed he had failed the nation when it needed him most. Years passed and the world continued to change. Kings and queens came and went. New generations grew up learning about the king who gave away his crown. Edward and Wallis remained together through every challenge. Their love survived criticism, loneliness, and the weight of history. When Edward looked back at the life he had left behind, he saw a crown that could never be returned. But beside him stood the woman for whom he had sacrificed everything. Whether the price was too high remains a question that historians still debate today. The story of King Edward VIII remains one of the greatest royal mysteries of the modern age. More than 80 years have passed, but people still ask the same question. Did Edward make the right choice? Some believe he was a man brave enough to follow his heart. Others believe he abandoned a sacred duty that had been trusted to him since birth. If Edward had remained king, the history of Britain might have been completely different. His brother King George VI would never have taken the throne. Princess Elizabeth might never have become Queen Elizabeth II. One decision changed the future of the British royal family for generations. Edward never wore the crown again. He never returned to the life he had once known. Instead, he spent the rest of his years beside Wallis Simpson, the woman for whom he had given up everything. In 1972, Edward passed away at the age of 77. Wallis lived until 1986. Their story came to an end. But the legend never faded. Even today, visitors stand outside the royal palaces and wonder what they would have done if they had faced the same impossible choice. Would they choose unlimited power? Or would they choose true love? History remembers Edward as the king who walked away from the greatest throne in the world. Not because he lost a war. Not because he was defeated by his enemies. But because he believed that life without the woman he loved was a life without meaning. His choice changed the British monarchy forever. And his story continues to remind the world that sometimes the most powerful crown is not made of gold. Sometimes the greatest victory belongs to the human heart. Life outside the royal family was very different from the world Edward had always known. There were no royal ceremonies. There were no crowds waiting to cheer their king. There were no palace balconies or grand celebrations. Edward and Wallis lived a quiet life across Europe. They traveled from country to country. They attended private events and met famous people from around the world. But no matter where they went, the story of the king who gave up his crown always followed them. Many newspapers continued to write about their lives. Some praised their love. Others believed Edward had made the greatest mistake of his life. Although he rarely spoke about his decision, many people believed Edward sometimes missed the life he had left behind. He had once stood at the center of the British Empire. Now he watched history from a distance. Years passed and Britain changed. The Second World War came and went. The royal family became a symbol of courage and hope for the nation. King George VI earned the respect of millions through his leadership during difficult times. Later Queen Elizabeth II began one of the longest and most remarkable reigns in British history. Edward could only watch as the future he was born to lead belonged to someone else. Yet through every challenge, Wallis remained by his side. The choice he had made in 1936 could never be undone. Whether it brought him complete happiness or quiet regret is something only Edward himself truly knew. His extraordinary decision continued to fascinate historians and people around the world. Even decades later, his story remained one of the most unforgettable chapters in the history of the British monarchy. The story of Edward VIII did not end with his abdication. It became a legend that has been discussed for generations. Historians continue to study every decision he made. Some believe he was one of the bravest men ever to wear the British crown. Others believe he failed the people who trusted him to lead the nation. His choice changed the future of the royal family forever. If Edward had remained king, history might have followed a completely different path. King George VI might never have ruled. Queen Elizabeth II might never have become one of the greatest monarchs in British history. One decision changed the destiny of an entire nation. Edward spent the rest of his life with Wallis Simpson. They remained together until the very end. In 1972, Edward passed away. 14 years later, Wallis also passed away. Their remarkable love story came to an end. But their names never disappeared from history. Even today, visitors walk through the halls of Buckingham Palace and Windsor Castle and remember the king who gave away the greatest throne in the world. His story reminds us that every choice comes with a price. Some people choose power. Some people choose duty. Edward chose love. Whether he made the right decision is a question that history can never answer. Only Edward himself knew what his heart truly felt. And perhaps that is why his story continues to capture the imagination of millions around the world. The king who gave up his crown for love will forever remain one of the most unforgettable figures in the history of the British monarchy. His legacy lives on not through the crown he lost, but through the extraordinary choice that changed history forever. History is often shaped by a single decision. Edward VIII made one choice that changed the future of Britain forever. But imagine for a moment that he had chosen differently. Imagine that Edward had remained king. The course of British history might have changed in ways no one could have predicted. King George VI would never have taken the throne. His daughter Princess Elizabeth might never have become Queen Elizabeth II. One of the longest and most respected reigns in British history might never have happened. The image of the modern British monarchy could have been completely different. Some historians believe Edward would have struggled as king because he often placed personal happiness above royal duty. Others believe he might have modernized the monarchy many years before it actually changed. No one can know what would have happened. History never gives a second chance. It only leaves questions that can never be fully answered. That is why the story of Edward continues to fascinate people around the world. It is not only a story about a king. It is a story about choice, about sacrifice, about responsibility, and about the price of following your heart. Every generation looks at Edward in a different way. Some see a romantic hero. Some see a king who abandoned his duty. Others simply see a man who refused to live a life without the woman he loved. Perhaps there is truth in every opinion. Because history is rarely simple. It is filled with difficult decisions that shape the future of nations. Edward made his decision. The crown passed to another king. And Britain entered a new chapter that would define the 20th century forever. The story of King Edward VIII is not only the story of a lost crown. It is the story of a man who stood between two worlds. One world demanded duty. The other world promised love. Edward was born to become a king. From childhood he was prepared to carry the weight of the British monarchy. He was given a future that millions of people could only dream about. But when the moment came, he discovered that even a king must make impossible choices. In December 1936, he walked away from the throne. He gave up power. He gave up his position. He gave up the life he had been prepared for since birth. All because he believed that happiness could not exist without the woman he loved. For some people, Edward was a symbol of courage. For others, he was a reminder that personal choices can affect millions of lives. But whatever opinion people have about him, one thing cannot be denied. His decision changed history forever. The British monarchy entered a new era. A new king took the throne. And a young Princess Elizabeth was placed on a path that would one day lead her to become queen. Edward never returned to the throne. But his name remained forever connected with one of the most dramatic moments in royal history. A king who lost his crown. A man who chose love over power. A decision that the world still remembers today. Because sometimes history is not changed by battles. It is changed by a single person making a single choice. This was the story of King Edward VIII. The king who gave up the crown. For the woman he loved. End.